Good morning. Day 10, COVID-19, lockdown South Africa. It's the 5th of April 2020. And as you know, I always refer to a book in the morning. And this was the one I picked up this morning. Discover Your Destiny, Robin Sharma. He's the author of The Monk Who Sold His Ferrari. And I got this book as a gift quite a few years ago. So I turned to page 80 and it says, one sage said it brilliantly when he recognized that life is like a river with two banks. On one bank you will find happiness, and on the other we will see sorrow. As we move along the banks, we inevitably brush against them. The real trick is not to stay on either of these banks of happiness or sorrow too long. So this instills a thought of sorrow, and how do we deal with sorrow? And the possible ways that sorrow affects you. During COVID-19, there's a lot of grief. I picked up an article, and that was a very current article written on a page called Psychology Today. And this article was written by Dr. Michelle Drouin. Now, Dr. Michelle has a PhD, and she's very renowned in her field as a lecturer and a research scholar. American-based research scholar. And her article was so relevant because she wrote this last month, on the 26th of March, if I remember clearly from what I read. An article says, the title says, Coping with Death During a Pandemic. The main thing that she talks about here is that we require patience. Now, when I look at infected countries throughout the world, Spain, if you look at their ice palace, it was a tourist attraction, and now it's become a morgue. Iran is adopting mass burials. And this is going on, in so many different countries, and they're having to cope. Funerals are being delayed, and in some countries, they don't even have people claiming the remains of their loved ones, or even contacting them to say, yes, that COVID-19 victim is a member of my family. So death is a crisis. It's always a crisis, but during a pandemic, it is a crisis of mammoth proportions. It brings me to our local news. A rural family had to bury their loved ones, and this was not a COVID-19 related death. So when they went to the Home Affairs, which is our place where you get the documentation, they couldn't get the proper documentation. They engaged in their rituals and performed the burial on their burial land, their family burial land. Now, those of you who don't know South Africa, we've got tons of land. It's one of the most gorgeous countries ever when it comes to land and, the facilities, the natural resources that we have. So they went ahead and they did it. Many have pointed fingers at them and said they shouldn't have done it. But I referred to another article by Dr. Alan Wolfert. Now, Dr. Alan Wolfert specifically says he's an expert on grief. And he said that funeral rituals are an absolutely important part of grieving. And social isolation, how do you do this? How do you cope with these funeral rituals and things like that? And of course, it's easier said than done. It's all very well for me to sit here and say, well, this is what I'm reading and this is what I'm sharing. But when you've lost a loved one and you have limited resources and you have things to do, it's not easy. So the first thing he suggests, and he gets his information from another often cited article, where he says, try to address the problem based on problem-focused strategies. We do understand that we need to look at it that way, but there are emotions involved. And when there are rituals, it's not just problem-focused strategies. We have to think of people. These are human beings. They have feelings, they have relationships with those that have passed on, and how they deal with it cannot just be objective, but we try. And all we can do is encourage them to try. Delaying the memorial is one of the strategies. And really, you have Hobson's choice in this. You have to do it. If you want a memorial, the largest memorial you can have is with 50 people. So if you really want to go the route of having a decent, a larger memorial, which, suits your needs and your culture, and out of respect for your cultural needs, it has to be delayed, unfortunately. You can stream the funeral using the simplest phone that has a camera and that can use the internet. However, that involves money. The other thing you can do is on your WhatsApp group or your social media groups, have collective obituaries. Give people a chance to express their grief as well. Because when a person dies, it's not just that person's death, it's everybody else that knew the person and loved the person. He talks about a silver lining that you should focus on, and I just couldn't find the silver lining in the article. And I read it a few times, and eventually I understood what he was speaking about. And the silver lining that he refers to is the opportunity for the immediate family to do everything that they have to without the disturbance, without the thought of the catering, the hall, and everything else that goes with it. There's a whole lot of logistics that go with funerals, and they're really not easy. So this is the silver lining that he's looking at, that you get a chance to do this without having to focus on the logistics and having to focus on the loss of a loved one. Also gives you that privacy. You reorganize one's thoughts. Very difficult to reorganize one's thoughts. But I think what he's referring to here is prioritizing one's thoughts. The last thing he says, which is definitely not recommended at any cost, avoid this. And that's denial, withdrawal, and even worse, the one that can lead to multiple problems, which you really don't have the means to cope with now. You don't have the mental state to cope with now during COVID-19. How much worse when you've lost a loved one? And that's what he talks about, substance abuse being the most dangerous way to handle it. Not recommended. Try to keep away from it. Maybe it's a good thing that bottle stores are not functioning and alcohol is not being sold. However, we all know that the other forms of substance abuse are freely available. And the saddest thing is that during a crisis and in the poorest of areas, that's where the people who engage in supplying these are capitalizing. Sad state of affairs, but it's a reality. Mourning and grief during this period is going to be totally, totally different. It's essential not to tell somebody how to mourn. It's their mourning, it's their personal grief. I would advise you or encourage you, I shouldn't be advising you because it's not what I do. I would encourage you and hope that you would empower others to support people through this period. Figuratively, hold their hands as you walk this emotional journey with them in a non-judgmental manner. I'd like to end with a few words quoted from Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. But before I quote her, I'd like to tell you who she is. This is a renowned American-Swiss psychiatrist from the World War II era till the 90s. And during World War II, she worked with the refugees in Zurich. In the 90s, she worked with HIV patients, and she did a lot of research on dying with the HIV patients. She also worked with hospice and established a few areas where people who were dying were advised to go by her, because this was a psychiatrist. Unfortunately, she died in a wheelchair, having suffered paraplegia, but her mental state was still brilliant. And she's the person who started the Kubler-Ross model of dealing with grief. And to conclude, the reality is that you will grieve forever. You will not get over the loss of a loved one. You will learn to live with it. You will heal and you will rebuild yourself around the loss you have suffered. You will be whole again, but you will never be the same. Nor should you, nor would you want to. Much love, be safe, and until we meet again, may God forever hold you in the palm of his hand.